fixated on the aircraft and ships and things that bring the goods over the long distances, but there's some crucial questions about how we get things delivered within cities. My name's Robert Wright. I'm shipping and logistics correspondent of the Financial Times. I'm delighted to be here. Tiny housekeeping point, please turn off your mobile phones. It can be an annoyance to other people, and I should say that as chairman, I'm quite capable of humiliating you from sitting up here. So it could be an embarrassment for you if your phone goes off. So do please make sure your phone's turned off. Now, there are an awful lot of issues for us to think about here. So to start us off, the International Transport Forum's prepared a short film for us to look at. We're going to have a quick look at that over the next 2 to 3 minutes, and then we're going to move on to the very distinguished panel of speakers that we've got coming to present to us. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to the film to get us started.
By 2030, 60% of the world's population will live in cities. For these 5 billion city dwellers, unimaginable quantities of goods will have to be moved in and distributed. There is no question. Better urban logistics is the key to making cities more livable and more sustainable. But where can policymakers act to create more seamless urban freight delivery that will reduce noise, pollution, and congestion? What are the key steps at city level? Is the future in freight consolidation? In electric delivery vehicles? Can cities better use their waterways? Should they encourage transports by bicycle or even underground? How should national governments support better urban logistics? Projects around the world highlight new approaches for last-mile delivery today. What can we learn from each other? By 2030, 60% of the world's population will live in cities.
I apologise for the mild moment of comedy at the end there. Now, we're hoping to have a lively discussion amongst everybody involved here, and I'm going to start by inviting up onto the platform the various speakers that we've got for this morning's session. I'm going to invite them in alphabetical order. There's no other preference here. So I'm going to ask first Wim Benz, the Managing Director of Dinolog, to come and join me up here. Then Michael Brown of Westminster University in the UK. Then Petra Kiewit of DHL. Manfred Neun of the European Cyclists Federation. And finally, Hans van der Werf of the Central Commission for Navigation on the Rhine. Now, we're going to be hearing from each of you in a few moments about some of your initial ideas on the questions we're going to be looking at. But I think first of all, we're going to go over to you, Petra Kiewit. You've got a few things to tell us about DHL's approach to these questions. So over to you.
This one?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So good morning to everybody. So I'm Petra Kiewit. I'm heading Solutions and Innovation within DHL, which is part of our commercial department or commercial unit. And I'm happy to be here to give you a brief overview on what we think about urban logistics. Well, let me probably start or outline with some trends which really will shape the future. So do I need to click myself, or is it somebody doing that for me? It's a technical question.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
It's only 2 slides, so it's easy. Hopefully. Yes,
I think that looks like a different slide. So.
Okay. So, thank you very much. I need to take this one. So, again, so let me probably outline some trends which will shape the future of us all, and I'd like to mention two trends. So one is the growth of the world's population, and another one is the increase of urbanization. This year, in 2012, the world's population will exceed 7 billion people, and it will reach 9 billion people in 2030. So, and in terms of urbanization, we have today the situation that really the first time in human history, more people living in cities, or more than half of the world population lives in cities, and this is an increasing share. So the United Nations and the World Bank, they estimate that the urbanization rate will reach 70% by 2050, which is really amazing. In terms of investments into urban infrastructure, this will amount to 350 trillion US dollar within the next 30 years, which is also, I think, an impressive number. So, and this all leads to the situation that we will have kind of mega cities in the future, and those cities will really represent the economy of tomorrow, and they will really, compete regionally and probably also globally for foreign direct investments, for natural resources, and also for talented people who live in those cities. And you see that a lot of challenges which we'll be facing in the future. And in terms of transportation, which is of course a topic here in this round, is besides the public transportation, logistic or supply chain. So how will the flows of goods come into those cities and out of those cities is really the challenge of the future. And we as DHL, as a leading. Okay. Is there another button?
This one.
I'm happy only having two slides, as I said.
Yeah.
So we, as a leading logistics provider, as DHL, we are thinking about that, of course. And you can basically two things. So either you just sit and wait, what's happening, what's happening in terms of development, in terms of regulation, or you can proactively think about intelligent solutions. And that's the approach we have chosen, to really think about intelligent things. And we are running a holistic city logistics program, or urban logistics program, which is part of our research and development initiative, and which is really about thinking about what are the future challenges all about, considering what's the new urban landscape, and then also aiming on really making a significant contribution to the ease of doing business and to the living standards of tomorrow. So we mainly think about technology-enabled solution, which optimizes the freight flows into the city, within a city or city districts, and also outside of a city. The most important buzzword or watchword is smart urban freight centers, which is kind of consolidation center, or probably outside a city, and bring the flows, the freight flows into the city. But also we also think about electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles, on smart routing solutions, utilizing real-time data for steering the flows, of optimizing the freight flows, and also we think also about supply chain operation centers, which make use of, utilize all this information much better than we do today. So, however, urban logistics is not really a standalone activity, so you need really support from the cities and from the government. So we think that's a kind of, it needs to be an integrated approach to urban planning, which also includes smart buildings, smart utilities, and also smart infrastructure. So that's roughly on the idea behind that, and just a couple of words on our initiative. So we run, as I said, a holistic city logistics program, and so we do a couple of things in different cities, which is, you see on the slide, Ningbo in China, Singapore, Istanbul, and London. And the idea here is to have a kind of tailor-made approach for each city, because every city is totally different from the next city. And the first thing is really to build strong alliances, local alliances, which you need, to support something or to do something in those cities. And just to give you a few examples. So in Ningbo, China, we have a collaboration with Siemens, which is a German company, and also with the CDI, which is the China Development Institute. It's really the think tank of the China government, and also with Deutsches Zentrum für Luft- und Raumfahrt and the Asia Development Bank. And the idea here is to really work on a city logistics master plan on the consolidation of last mile delivery. And just one other example, to stick to my 4 or 5 minutes. In Istanbul, we do a different thing. So we are conducting a study together with the university in Istanbul and with Turkcell and IKEA, just for one district within Istanbul, which is the greater municipality, and which thinks about the inner logistics flows in Istanbul, in another big city. So in Singapore, we do some similar things. And, as I said, build strong relationships to look into the future, to see what could the appropriate business model be, and then create those things.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that. Now, you've given us a logistics operator's perspective in this. I want now to come over to Wim Benz. You're director of, I think you've got a microphone there. Let's keep this one down here. You're director of the Dutch Institute for Advanced Logistics, so you take perhaps a slightly more theoretical approach to this. I mean, can you tell us a bit about what issues you think need to be looked at in getting urban logistics to work better? What are the kind of things people should be addressing and studying?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Wim Benz indeed. We, as Dynalog, we execute the National Innovation Program in the Netherlands. If you need more information, I'm willing to tell you afterwards. Two things that I would like to address in this first statement is one, if you look at, for example, how a company like Ahold organizes the total, let's say, supply chain to their supermarkets and retail shops. They just showed in the past few years that they can completely eliminate their warehouse part of the shop and change it to, let's say, shop floor, which brings in much more money. But that whole concept is based on just-in-time delivery. If you look at city distribution, if we all want just-in-time delivery, then you have a lot of traffic that has to go into that city, part by part, parcel by parcel, or pallet by pallet. So what we challenge the let's say the logistics sector and all kinds of stakeholders involved is the concept of putting a city distribution center at the site of a city center, is that the right solution? If you look at how Ahold has solved it, they have just eliminated that function from the supply chain by organizing smarter logistics backwards into the value chain. So not in the shop they organize the supplies, they not in their own distribution center, but it's even being organized in the distribution centers of their suppliers. So smart logistics really changes the world of logistics at Albert Heijn. And if you look at supplying city shops, then you should also reconsider the current way of providing supplies to shops in city centers. And this requires, and that's my second remark, and there's a lot of things to be found out and discovered and developed, is this requires collaboration. Collaboration between different types of players who mainly are competitors, retailers with other retailers, transport companies with other transport companies, all kinds of parties that have to collaborate to rethink the complete logistic structure to provide this last mile solution. And that means that if you want people to collaborate, you have to think of what are the changing business models, what are pricing strategies, how about risk agreements, about benefits, about incentive structures. What if my parcel is delayed and we bundle? Who pays? What if I'm in a hurry and you're not? Who pays? So all these changes in models, that is something that we don't have covered yet in this type of solution. So for us, it's all about smart logistics and rethinking logistics. That's the challenge. We don't focus on the infrastructure, not on the vehicle or transport mode as such, but on the smart logistic part of organizing all this together.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And Manfred Noyne, our next speaker, has just suggested to me that it would be a good idea to get the list of speakers back if we can. It's a beautiful slide, but if we could get, if somebody could bring the list of speakers back, that would be, yeah. No, it's a beautiful slide. Nobody's saying anything else, but now we're now going to move on to. So we've had an operator's perspective, a slightly more theoretical perspective. We're now getting down to the nitty-gritty of a couple of actual means of delivering things. And I'm now going to come over to Manfred Noyne of the European Cyclist Federation. Now, I think some of you will already know that I'm slightly party pre here in that I'm an enthusiastic cyclist and blog about cycling. I'm going to try to be even-handed, however. Now, Manfred Noyne, the image of cycling as a means of delivering things around cities, people probably think it's a rather old-fashioned thing. People think about, you know, a messenger boy with an old-fashioned bike riding around a city. Does it really have a part to play in the future of urban logistics, and what part is that?
Well, thank you very much, Robert, for giving me the floor. Well, it's a very, very good perspective for sure. And we have many cities all over the world who are practicing this. We, on the ECF side, being the umbrella of the cycling federations in Europe and abroad, so being the voice of the cyclists in total, we are allowed to say that we have an increasing demand for cycling solutions. And I agree very much with Petra Kiewit. She said, when we know what will happen, we can wait or we can act. Yeah. And for sure, we are going for the second alternative. And this means to look, first of all, to the economic perspective of cycling. And the economic perspective of cycling tells us we have developed a system with 9 key issues on that. But let me mention only 3 of them. The others, if you are interested, you can see on the ECF website. But those 3 I would like to mention are the 3 very modern modes of cycling. And this is beside the cargo cycling, it's cycling, it's public cycling, the public sharing schemes, and it's e-cycling, the e-mobility by cycling. So these 3 issues are bringing a high impact for a fast and good development. Secondly, let me mention, why are cycling cities livable cities? This is not only because people are moving, because they are practicing active mobility. It's also because the shop owners in downtowns like the shopping people by cycling, for they are, as we know in the meantime, much more quality-oriented. Some of them are buying day by day fresh goods there. They are not going for the weekly purchase outside to a big mall or something like that. No, they are going day by day for their shopping and get it fresh. Now, this means how can we get all those goods into the city centers? I think this was a big problem in the past. And for sure, it's not the way for the future that we do it in a one-way transport from A to B by huge trucks. No, we have to go to do it in 2 steps, bring it by truck or by train to the outside of the city, and from there in a cargo delivery center, from there by small vans or especially by cargo cycles into the city center. And if you look to the advantages of flexibility and of the space they need, for sure, this is a quite good solution. What we need now, and this brings me to the second point, we need a fair competition of all the modes of transport. We do not need more. Let the competition run, and especially politicians must know, policy decision makers on all levels must know that we need this fair competition to achieve in seamless transport. Seamless transport means an integrated transport of the different modes. And if those different modes in their development are not running in a fair competition, how shall we then achieve in seamless transport? I think this is a key point. And we have to work on that, not anymore, but especially in market economies, we like the competition, and we know how competition is able to boost the development. And third, last not least, let me mention that we have all those good things available here in Leipzig, here at the summit. We have 3 booths outside, and you can find fact sheets, you can find a paper on these relations in total, and also a small leaflet cycling the seamless change, where all these perspectives for the future are brought together in a very close overview. So, livable cities and sustainable cities means cycling must play a role. That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Now we're going to move briefly on to another specific mode of transport. A lot of European cities are close to major waterways, and we often tend to think of city logistics as being something that just moves in one form or another in dry land. Hans van der Werf is the Deputy Secretary General of the Central Commission for Navigation of the Rhine, much the best used waterway in Europe for long-distance transport of goods. There are obviously some challenges about integrating waterways into urban transport, not least that there aren't that many places where the ultimate destination of the goods is right by the waterway. Can you tell us a bit about what role you think waterways can play in urban logistics?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation, because as quite a modern mode of transport, it's an honor to be able to express our views in this respect. Inland waterway transport and urban transport, it's merely back to the future. If you look at the situation for 100, 200 years, by the way, in that time, my organization was grounded in 1815. Inland waterway transport was the basic mode of transport in many cities, and what is encouraging is that at least a number of them recognize now the value of this mode of transport and use it both for the upstream activities until the last mile and for the last mile. Various examples of cities have shown the potential. What is important when discussing the way to it? In the context of the, let's say, overall logistic profile of inland waterway transport, it's not evident that a specific role is reserved. 75% of the market served by inland waterway transport concerns the extension of intercontinental trades. 30% is intra-continental trade. The remaining 5% is shared with passenger vessels cruising. So in volume, it's still modest, but the potential has been proved during the last 10 years. How does this potential can come to life? First of all, the experiences show that it should be developed on the basis of specific traits. Including inland navigation in a, let's say, global approach of urban transport is a bit hazardous. The specific advantages can be developed on the basis of specific needs that are defined in the urban context. Examples are the supply of building material, which is low-cost material, where transport cost in the final price of the material constitute a major part. But not only building material, even consumer goods, if you realize the upstream consolidation, can be brought to almost the front of the distribution centers in the city. An optimization is needed between the delivery on the urban consolidation centers and the last miles. Here, specific material should be developed, and the examples we see in inland navigation is that, in fact, specific boats have been designed and specific containers have been developed, including specific transshipment equipment to get them on the quays and to eventually distribute them into the local network to the final destination. An important element in this approach is that the cities, that is the municipal authorities, stop using former harbor plans and areas for housing. Of course, everyone understands that there is a great interest in using the former let's say, port activity sites for housing. These offer the best prices and the best qualities for people living there. But the role of these sites for a sustainable development of local and urban transport is of utmost importance. There is a beginning of recognition in this respect, but a great effort is still to be done. And then, finally, it has been said already, what is important when developing these kinds of transport is that you realize to bring together all the stakeholders, starting with the politics and the authorities, and finalizing with the operators, the logistic operators, and the interested parties in the urban transport activity. Together, they can find the solutions, the material, and the level playing field necessary for an economic and market-oriented approach. I might perhaps sum up cities with specific examples and successful stories in this respect: Paris, Brussels, London, Berlin, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Hamburg, or even a smaller city like the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands, knowing a real beer supply by barge, which has brought into life on the basis of the kind of platforms I mentioned. In other ways, inland waterway transport, as we call it now, the blue way. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. van der Werf. Now, finally, in this section of things, now you've been talking about. We've been talking about the nitty-gritty kind of things that are happening on the ground. We've been talking about which cities have used inland waterways, the role of the bicycle, and so on. There's an overall policy framework for this, I think, Michael Brown. How do you put together, how do you meet the challenge, do you think, of marrying overall city policy and the kind of things that are happening on the ground? How do you meet that challenge of shaping those two things that can often work a little bit against each other?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope is the microphone working? I hope so. It's. I mean, in fact, we had a discussion this morning on a side event here, looking at experts with people coming from Japan, from the United States, from Portugal, France, and the European Commission, talking about some of these issues. And I think the point that sort of jumps out at me is that clearly there are lots of solutions. That's great. There are lots of things we could do. That's also great. But often that makes life complicated because it's hard to know which policy to choose. It's hard to know which one to follow. It's hard to know which thing to invest in. And in a way, for policymakers, this range of solutions poses a challenge. And I think we need to sort of think about that and think about frameworks where we might address that. And very often in cities, when we're thinking about cities, we have lots of different scales we could talk about them at. So when people talk about Paris, what do they really mean? When they talk about London, what do they mean? The centre of London's not the same as the edge of London, and so on. So there's an issue around this about how to address the different levels of policy in terms of these kind of solutions that are available. And, you know, we know all this, and actually, you know, some of the solutions that we've heard about are, you know, are pretty straightforward and could be implemented. And you think to yourself, well, if we know all this, and if we want to do something, what's actually stopping us from doing that? And I think it's important to recognise what's making it difficult and what might be stopping us. And I think there are three areas where we can sort of focus on that. The first is, I think, the number of different actors or stakeholders, or however we want to characterise it. This really makes it tough. And, you know, it's easy to say, let's have a win-win situation. But I chair the Central London Freight Quality Partnership, bringing together the Central London local government and business. And it's sometimes hard to find win-wins, and you have to really work at it. So actually, number is a problem. And I think the second problem has come out of the presentation so far, and people have commented on this already, complexity. Complexity in terms of the supply chains, complexity in terms of the city, and complexity, I think, in terms of what we know. We lack some hard information on which to build these plans, and as Petra said, studies. You know, DHL involved in studies, the other organisations involved in studies. This is important. We need to recognise this, because to make good plans and to have transparent decision-making, we need information and we need hard evidence on which to base that. So, you know, how do we get nearer to that stage? And again, I think there are sort of some things we can think about in that sense. I think to engage with the stakeholders, there's not a single simple solution, because we need a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. And so within cities, we have to you know, find people who are going to take this strategic leadership and also then, if you like, foster the change at a more local level. So strategic decision makers in cities need to think about it, but then they have to come up with ways to actually encourage the local involvement and local engagement and industry involvement. And plans that are made at the city level need to focus very much on the goals and not get too tied up in specific solutions, because sometimes we have people at the policy level wanting to dictate solutions when actually the best people to make the solutions are the people on the ground who know how to do it. So let's concentrate on what the problem is, what we want to solve, and then let's let the creative people at the industry level come up with solutions for that. So the framework is important. And I think in terms of that, you know, there is a need to engage with the operators, the people who actually provide all this, all the movement, but also with the receivers. Because very often when you talk to the receivers in the city and you talk about their upstream supply chain and the effect on urban freight, they look at you rather blankly about the upstream supply chain and the effect on urban freight, because the stuff just gets there, doesn't it? And what are you trying to change and what are you trying to do? So we need to engage them much more actively in this. And as I say, we need to build these partnerships at different levels. And that needs time and it needs leadership. And I think both of those things are in rather short supply sometimes, actually. And so it's challenging. I think to finish with, you know, I think it is important that we have the highest level in terms of policy and involvement engaged in this, because that's what unlocks the change. It's very easy to explain to people why it's difficult to change things. It's much harder to unlock that. And I know from speaking from the experience in London that the Olympics has been a catalyst for us to think about urban freight movements, and that's meant that policymakers at a very high level have sort of got much more involved in this discussion, and that's going to be very important in the longer term. But we can't wait for an Olympics to come to every city, so we have to find reasons why people at the most senior level would like to get involved. And then we need to work out, you know, how to get these partnerships, and I think what people said was really interesting. Not just public-private partnerships, but private-private partnerships and public-public partnerships. Because, again, in London, when someone from Westminster says to someone from Camden about how to do something, that has a lot of credibility and a lot of weight. So to end, you know, I think we need to create these frameworks in which these solutions can be brought together. To do that, we need to think about processes and structure, and we need to support these things with evidence, which does require, you know, hard numbers, hard information, and we've got to be more open and willing to share some of that data in order to make collectively, you know, better system in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's all the opening statements we've got from our panellists. We're now going to move on to the discussion part of the session. And I'm going to be talking a little bit amongst the panelists, and I want people on the floor to start thinking about what they might say. But to start us off, the background to an awful lot of what we're talking about at the moment is that the economic crisis in across Europe, across the world. And I think we've got Professor George Giannopoulos of Thessaloniki University ready to give us a few thoughts just to get us moving on that issue.
Thank you very much, Robert. Ladies and gentlemen, excuse my back. I don't know how to stay. I suppose here I'm okay. Well, I'm supposed to say something starting the discussion on urban logistics in the time of economic crisis. And I think the first point I wanted to make is that the economic crisis, first of all, brings us a little bit closer to the situation which Petra described of the 2030s and 50s, in which our cities will be more, if you like, in a critical state. And secondly, of course, that it's not only my country, Greece, or a few other countries that now happen to be in this difficult situation. Every other country is a potential candidate, unfortunately, of experiencing this. So the lessons we have to see of how we deal with this situation in a kind of economic crisis are very important and very pertinent. So what are really the sort of characteristics of the situation that we are experiencing now? First of all, of course, scarcity of investment for building infrastructures, for building consolidation centers and so on. Scarcity of initiatives for fleet renewal. We're talking about electric vehicles and so on, but it's difficult to find the investment for that. In a strange way, I would say legal and institutional frameworks seem to be changing more often, and they are more difficult to implement when we have scarcity of financing. Also, the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms are less stringent for obvious reasons, but I can go in more detail later on. Energy efficiency and environmental impacts take, I'm afraid, secondary importance when you don't really have the means to go about in the economy. And finally, traffic management and control become less sophisticated and effective due to lack of maintenance and new involvement. But there are two positive effects, I would say. One positive effect in a strange way is when in a situation you have, like in my country for the last 2 years, you have more than 30% of businesses that have closed down. Obviously you have less demand and less urgency for urban deliveries, and urban traffic is also less. In Greece, anything between 15 and 30% of urban traffic in the streets have been reduced, depending on the situation. And of course, that another good thing, if I can say so, is that people are more willing to kind of cooperate, explore ways in which they didn't even think before, and optimize. And trying to optimize, I think, is the way forward. And just to mention a few points on how to go about in improving urban freight distribution in a period of economic austerity, I would mention a few actions and activities that really have to do with optimizing the system. That's all you can do. You have to really lower logistics operational costs through economies of scale, like better capacity utilization, like centralized stock holding, and so on. You can create sufficient critical mass of demand, because demand is falling, through a systematic registration of needs and information dissemination. You can use low-cost soft infrastructures, smart infrastructures, to improve customer service levels at all levels. Provide value-adding activities as an add-on service to induce more demand. Exercise more central decision-making to regulate delivery hours and control and so on. I already mentioned that the regulatory framework is more, if you like, easily changing. and of course exploit the scientific and expert local know-how which exists. In other words, exploit your human resource capacity. Some of the speakers also mentioned that. I wanted to mention as a case study Thessaloniki, but I'll come back to that during the discussion to show you what we have done as a case study in Thessaloniki.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Giannopoulos. Now, I'm going to come back to each of our panellists with one point just as we get ready to receive questions from the floor. Please do be thinking of those questions. And I want to go first to you, Wim Benz. You talked about the retailer, I think it was Ahold, that had cut out its distribution centres. This perhaps feeds in a little bit to what Professor Giannopoulos has been saying to us. He's been talking about people looking to use their capacity better. And I think one of the things that's happened in the economic crisis is that people have been looking to slim down their supply chains, carry less stock and so on. But I just wonder, the question in my mind about this idea that you get rid of the distribution centres is who actually ends up holding the stock buffer, and where does that cost fall? Because, I mean, I write a lot about shipping, and ports are always complaining, well, people are just using us as the warehouse, so leaving the containers here. Our ports coming up because people have closed their warehouses. Where does the stock end up sitting, and how can you maximize the efficiency of that system?
First of all, optimizing logistics means try to reduce stock as much as possible, because stock means dead value. So keep goods moving, and if not, push them back as far as possible into the value chain that reduces the value and the capital involved. But I also want to comment on one of the remarks my neighbor made. We always strive for win-win situations. If you really want to change the last mile discussion, then probably some of the players in the collaboration will have to accept a win-lose situation. If we reduce the amount of trucks, or if we can reduce the amount of kilometers driven, whether if it's changing modalities or optimizing the usage of the assets, then you have to accept that individual players might have a lose situation if you don't change the business models, the revenue models, and the agreements between the different players. It's unacceptable and it's unsolvable if you only want to have win-win situations, because then nothing changes. And if you look at those warehouses, if you look at what happened historically, municipalities push out the, let's say, dirty trucks outside of the city. So they set up constraints in time zones or slots, or they want to accept no longer that a specific type of truck comes in. So they push the cargo out of the city to the side of the city. And that's naturally where then stock is being created in a sort of city distribution center. But that is not necessarily the most optimized solution. By just pushing it back, maybe that's not optimized. And what the government and the municipalities put in is constraints. The logistics server provider should look at it as a challenge instead of fighting back to get rid of those constraints. Because they are there and they won't go away. It's unacceptable to keep doing as we did it yesterday, and accept the lose situation, but renegotiate the business model between the different players. And that should be a proactive strategy instead of a defensive strategy. And then words like what you mentioned, leadership, vision, they come around, and you have to find them.
Yeah, okay. I mean, perhaps Michael Brown, perhaps you could explain to us a bit about, we've mentioned these urban constraints. I think in London quite a lot of things changed with the Central London congestion charge. Could you tell us a little bit about how distribution in London changed as a result of that? Or perhaps,
well, I think, when the congestion charge was introduced, it's very little change in terms of freight behaviour, and freight companies had to pay their, starting at £5 and now £10 for entering the city, because the constraints within the logistics systems and supply chains they're operating in mean that that type of charge is not an incentive to change the time of day at which you deliver, and it just, in a sense, it represents another cost that they have to bear. So I think a lot of policies are blunt instruments, and if we want to deal with urban freight, we've got to really think very hard about urban freight and logistics and supply chains, and not get sort of carried away with the idea that, we need consolidation centres because there's no consolidation, because as the people on the panel will explain, there's a lot of consolidation in these supply chains already. So it's, let's pick out the bits where there isn't any, or there's not enough, and let's focus on those bits. But I go back to the point that to do that, we need more transparency and visibility. And where that exists within industry, we need to get better at reflecting that back to the people who can actually make policy about that. Yeah, okay. Now, to come on to Petra Kivit, we heard from Professor Giannopoulos the idea that in a time of constraint people don't care about the environment and so on, and that has gone down the agenda as people have become more pressed economically. What's the case for DHL? Have you forgotten about the environment since the economic crisis started?
That's a good question, I think. Of course not. So, I mean, that we run a dedicated program, in terms of saving CO2 emission for a couple of years now, by the way. And we do a lot of things with regard to that. So just give you one example, a couple of examples. So we do tests and pilots with electric vehicles and with more than 100 vehicles only in Germany. We do cooperations with various manufacturers on that. We also test, hybrid cars or hybrid vehicles and stuff like that. And I mean, I think that, reflecting what my colleagues were saying, the future in the city is multimodal, for sure. And I mean, that we as not only DHL, that we are Deutsche Post and DHL, and in Deutsche Post we use bicycles. I mean, at least in Germany, not hundreds of thousands probably, but a substantial amount of bicycles, of bikes. And why not, having a vision into the future, why not using smart underground trains going into our smart urban freight centers, and then, do a kind of exchange then over there, and then make use for the next mile into the districts, with probably electric vehicles, and then why don't using even people for really doing the last mile or the last meter, So that's all about the ideas which we have in mind. So to answer your question quickly, yes, of course we care about the environment, and of course we think about, different modes which protect the nature and which are efficient in the last mile delivery.
I mean, it does strike me that potentially one of the things for a logistics company recently is that the time of economic constraint has come at the same time as very high oil prices. So I imagine for you at the moment there isn't a trade-off between protecting the environment and saving money. At the moment, any kind of means of introducing logistics that uses less fuel has to be an advantage for you, doesn't it? I mean, how much of a constraint on you is the fuel price, and how much is that pushing you towards using greener forms of transport?
I mean, again, as I said, the oil price, costs, of course, is a driver for thinking about new technology or thinking about different vehicles or, transport modes. But not only the price. I mean, it's a combination of the price, the costs, but also the nature, and being as efficient as possible. I mean, and what you were saying a couple of minutes earlier. So logistics as such should be a kind of the most efficient way to come from A to B, right? So otherwise, we won't do a good job on that. So we have drivers which, as said, costs, oil price, stuff like that, but we see also some other constraints or probably also possibilities, to change our modes and to make use of everything which is possible. And probably we have something which is new, which we don't know today, hopefully, because I'm working on innovation, and I think we invent something which probably we can utilize in the future.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm perhaps going to throw some of these points over to Manfred Neun, because obviously you represent a particular mode of transport. One thing I do wonder about bicycle-based logistics, as I said, I'm a very keen cyclist, but I'm wondering if what the constraints are on what you can actually move by bicycle, because there's obviously, there comes a weight limit, and there comes a point at which, and obviously a bicycle is not able to carry as much stuff as a delivery van or something like that, and possibly also had some limits in range. So what do you see as the limits on what bicycle logistics can do?
Well, to start with the easy part of the question, until now, cargo bikes are able to deliver between 80 kilogram and 250 kilogram. But this may increase by using electric-assisted systems. And when you are looking outside to the different items we have already here, well, some of them are looking quite old-fashioned. Christiania bike or some items like that. But some others are showing that this is a quite modern technique. Also here you can find innovation, looking to the product. But the product is not all. I think we make a huge mistake when we think that we can produce livability in cities with technical solutions. To create livability means you need people. You need people there. And how can you bring people into cities? How are you creating this livability? Thanks to Michael Brown, who mentioned also that we have the problem in engaging decision makers because of the complexity of systems. We make the huge mistake that we are coming from the IT solutions, which is quite wonderful to steer the process. But this not automatically means that we then have that we have to do all the work for cargo also by machines. No, we have to do the contrary. We are talking here about the last mile. And the last mile needs, for livability, the integration, the participation of people. And this is the huge advantage of cycling. And we can see this in a growing demand. Thessaloniki, for example, now is our newest member, and we both are not directly involved in. Thessaloniki is our newest member in our global cities network. There are also cities like Rio. Rio is preparing now 2014 and 2016, the World Soccer Championship and the Olympic Games. And they have a master plan. And cycling is playing a certain role in this master plan, in total, but also including cargo cycling.
But aren't there going to be, there are always going to be certain, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how much a small delivery van can carry, but it can probably carry 5, 6, 7 tons of goods, compared with a vehicle that can carry at most 250 kilograms. I mean, I'm just wondering what market it is that
if you are taking the so-called small vans, the micro vans, which are able also to enter the city center. We have growing restrictions there to enter the city centers, downtowns during the day, all over the day. So you need something like the Golf, which has only half a ton. Mm-hmm. This is just the double of the cargo cycles I mentioned. But you can install 2 or 3 of the cargo bikes at the same time, where one of these micro vans is running. So that means you are much more flexible with the cycle solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I want to ask you, Hans van der Werf, perhaps a similar kind of question. It strikes me, and perhaps some other panelists or people from the floor would like to address this at some point. We've been talking about logistics, but it strikes me we've been talking about lots of different things. We're talking about everything from probably relatively small package delivery. You were talking about the delivery of building materials. These are clearly different kinds of things. So I wonder, are there restrictions on the areas that you think waterways can serve, and which particular areas do you think they're best placed to address?
Well, to a certain extent, we are faced with opposite problems as my neighbor. He has to face with the maximum of load he can carry. We need a minimum load to be reasonable and to be economical. And that starts somewhere by some 20, 40 tons, but better, be it 200, 250 tons. But all depends on the specific scheme you're in. I was talking about building material because that's evident. Building material is something that is evident for larger, let's say, urban regions. Building is going on all the time, and building produces enormous transport. We have had the example of, before the Olympic Games in London, the example of Berlin, some 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when the city center was completely new, constructed, and inland navigation, due to the fact that waterways were available, was largely included in the logistic concepts. I would say that is a prime condition, quite evident, of course, but we need water. We need, let's say, a navigable waterway. But in many cases, they are there, simply neglected, not used for perhaps even a century for transport purposes, because with the growth of the ships and the vessels and the activities, the activity itself has been outplaced out of the city centers. So now we are gaining back the area and trying to come in it. Not only building material and not only waste. Those two are quite evident as they are fit for consolidation in a quite evident way. But also, let's say, consumer goods. We were quite happy with the announcement 2 months ago from Monoprix, a French distributor of consumer goods, to use inland waterway transport and the area around the Tour Eiffel in Paris to distribute to the supermarkets in that area. 7 or 8 are being delivered now, almost completely by inland barge. Well, that about the physical conditions when they are fit, and I talked about some platforms for the transshipment and the handling of the cargo. Even that could be done afloat. Once space is available, you can bring it in a floating way on a pontoon with cranes and whatsoever. Point is, you should develop the instruments, and therefore the top-down and bottom-up combined approach is absolutely necessary. We should not precondition the solutions, but be innovative in all respect and develop, complete some new systems when these are necessary to make it viable.
Now, when you talk about the moving consumer goods, for instance, by waterway, I used to live in Budapest, which is obviously in the Danube, and there was a constant effort there to get containerized goods moving in the Danube. And there was a regular problem, now perhaps this doesn't apply as much to the Rhine, but there was a regular problem with navigation conditions on the Danube, just making it really too unreliable for those time-critical type goods, which are clearly going to be many of the things that are moving into city centres. It's obviously not the case so much with building materials, but with some of these consumer goods, people want to have low inventories, so they want things to arrive on time. And I think the hydrological conditions on a lot of inland waterways present a bit of a challenge with making that properly reliable. What can you tell us about that?
Well, on the longer distances, indeed, reliability is an issue, at least as far as natural rivers are involved. We do not control them, fortunately, I would say. But on the local and regional level, the situation is much more stable, and reliability as such should not be a problem. It isn't a problem in the cities I mentioned, including Paris and Berlin. Here, there is always water, and it is seldom that there is too much water that no navigation can take place. But on the longer distances, and we should recognize Budapest is quite far away from the Black Sea as it is from the North Sea. And there you can come across all kinds of difficulties. I know the Danube is a real worry regarding the navigable conditions. They are studying on it, how to improve it. Fortunately, we do not have it on the Rhine. We also have difficulties, but not at that extent that the logistic performance is questioned. Well.
Yeah, okay. I mean, perhaps you could tell us a bit, Petrokiewicz, do you manage to integrate inland waterways into your systems, and if not, why not?
So that's really a good question. So I'd like the idea to think about that actually. So I live in Cologne, which is a city where the Rhine is, as you know, in the middle of the city, and I'm just imagine, I just imagine how it would look like to see, all the yellow delivery people from DHL being on the Rhine. I mean, that's amazing, I think. So, but seriously, I think this is an issue, an opportunity, which we haven't thought about yet so far. But I think at least in cities where we have waterways and where we have the possibilities to make use of them, why not? I mean, that's probably a thing for the future, but not yet, to be honest.
In Amsterdam you do.
We do? We do?
He's saying that in Amsterdam.
Do you
We
know
couldn't hear because of the microphone, but...
I would only say in Amsterdam you do.
Right.
Yeah, okay, but Amsterdam is a specific situation, right? Yeah.
Right, okay. Now, I'm keen now to see if there are I've got plenty of things I still want to ask, but are there points that people want to make from the audience about what we've been hearing so far? Deathly silence for the moment. Now somebody's got his courage up over here. If you could just tell us who you are and why you're here and whom you'd like to address the question.
My name is Dietmar Winkler. I'm editor at Verkehrsrundschau, a German magazine on transport and logistics. And we did not talk about electromobility yet. So what is the potential of electromobility in the inner city transport? Maybe the question to Ms. Kiewit.
Okay, so electromobility, you mean using electric vehicles?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, right, okay. I'll tell you what, first of all, before I go over to Petrokiewicz, I'm going to go to the electric vehicles rival. If you're interested in not having emissions in cities, surely you could have a nice electric car like the one that brought me here, and maybe that's a better solution than a bicycle. What can you tell us about that?
I have to oppose. Well, you need both. For sure you may need both. You need the e-cars or the e-vans and the e-bicycles. You need both. Yeah? You need the cars for the heavier tools, but you must know that 25% of all goods being delivered, this is part of our study, of our European cycle mobility study, 25% of all goods can be delivered with cargo bicycles. And 50% of all the light goods. For example, the goods we were delivering from Brussels to here to the ITF, this was managed on the last mile. I think these are maybe 5 or 6 or 10 miles from the station to here. This was delivered by a cargo cycle company. Wonderful, great, it works, it exists. And of course, in the future, we also will have a change from the fossil-driven cars and vans to the electric cars, for sure, especially in city centers, that's fine. But looking to the increasing energy prices, looking also to the congestion charges and tolls and other restrictions we may have there, that vans are not allowed to deliver all over the day, while cargo cycles are allowed to do that. Yeah, the advantages are very, very clear. And therefore, I said in the very beginning, we like a fair competition on that. That's it.
Okay. Petrokiewicz, perhaps you could tell us a bit about the role of electric vehicles.
So electric vehicles. So I think I touched it a bit a couple of minutes earlier. So of course we make use of electric vehicles. We have been running a couple of field tests in Germany, but also abroad, with a variety of manufacturers. And we need to assess that and think about what does it mean for the future for us, for our fleet. And you all know that there are still some issues with electric vehicles, so with weight, with the right licenses, which goes along with the weight, with cost, of course, and stuff like that. So, but I think, of course, the future is hybrid and electric vehicle, and as I said, multimodal with some other transport modes.
Can I just add a very quick point, because I think the question's a very good question, very topical and very important, but it sort of exemplifies why it's tricky, because what is the problem that we're solving? Is it the occupancy of the curb space? So if it is, we can take the cargo cycles and we could work out curb meter minutes or something like this, or is it the CO2 or the total energy embedded in a product in the middle of the city? And if that was the case, we might want to think about the size of the vehicle that we were using. And we might, in some cases, if we were trying to minimize the total energy, we might accept larger vehicles rather than smaller ones, however they're powered. And then if we want to minimize the CO2, we have to think about the source of the electricity generation. So if you implement a solution like this in France, then the CO2 impact will be bigger than if you implement the same solution in the UK, where we're generating electricity using with a fairly high amount of CO2 in it. So we have to be very, it's a very important topic, but we have to also then go to the next level and say, no, we need to agree about the problem and the solution for that, and have a proper, a debate about that.
Well, that's an excellent point. Thanks for making it. And it strikes. I wonder if I can maybe throw this over to Wim Benz. Actually, there is a straightforward philosophical question about what we're trying to tackle when we're trying to tackle the problems in cities. London has a congestion charge. The congestion charge started out as a relatively straightforward charge for using road space. However, a big truck doesn't pay any more than a small car, so it's already imperfect. There are then several complexities to the London charge to do with the amount of emissions you make, which then starts confusing the picture even further. I mean, do you think, how far do you think the problem is use of road space, in which case probably cargo cycles are quite a good way of making more efficient use of road space and putting smaller lumps of metal on the roads, and how much is the problem the CO2 emissions, and how do we balance the approach between tackling these two problems?
Yeah, but then I would like to answer that more in general, not focusing pure on the last mile, but more in general on the whole transport chain. One of the remarks I wanted to make was the title of this panel debate is Rethinking the Last Mile. Maybe we should first start having a discussion eliminating the last mile. That really makes it clean, right? If we replace the vehicle, we save 5% or 10% CO2 reduction. But if we can eliminate and avoid that transport has to take place, then we save 100%. And that's one of that's my step up to the next remark. In the Netherlands, we calculated 1.5, 2 years ago, the average usage of truck capacity on the highway, how much loading, how much do they carry on average, was at that time on average 48%, which means every truck drives around on average with 52% unloaded. You can never reach 100%, that's clear. But we made simple calculations that if you can increase the 48% usage to 65%, then immediately all the traffic jams in the Netherlands are gone. Unless there's an accident, of course, but let's say the standard traffic jam, the standard congestion, if you can increase the 48% usage to 65, which is not that dramatically high, then all the congestion is gone. Another study proves the city of Breda, which is, we call it a city, but if you look at a world scale, it's a large village, so to say. In Breda, it's about 170,000 people living there, so it's only a small city. Every day, to bring all the materials to the shops in the city center of Breda, 1,900 trucks go in every day. On average, less than 10% of the cargo being delivered requires a truck. Less than 10%, because it's in volume so big, you need a truck to get it there. Over 90%, you don't need a truck. And you mentioned 25%. In the study in Breda, over 40% of all the deliveries is only one box, for which a big truck comes in, has to park there, open up, bring one box in, and then leave. And this all is there because this truck delivers one HEMA in Breda, and then goes to the next city, to the HEMA in Tilburg, and then goes to the next HEMA in Den Bosch. And 5 minutes later, a new truck comes in who does all the deliveries for, let's say, Vroom and Reesman or whatever other shop, and they do 25 of those shops in 25 cities. If you could combine those deliveries, one truck brings everything for 25 shops in one city, that means redesign the whole supply chain, but a few steps backward in the value chain. And we made calculations that, theoretically, from 1,900 delivery trucks today in Breda, you could reduce that to less than 10% of the amount of trucks, without changing the type of truck or cleaner trucks or electrical trucks or whatsoever, by just smart logistics. And we always talk about infrastructure, which is always millions or billions of euros investments in barges, in vessels, in trucks, in roads, in trains. If you only invest a few percent in using the infrastructure much smarter, you get much bigger savings.
Now, it strikes me there's some potential challenges with that. There's a question about, do you end up creating lots of extra truck journeys to and from the distribution centre where you consolidate it or something like that? I mean, I just wonder, Petra Kevit, how much, sorry, you're the operator here, so you end up getting picked on.
Every question ends up with me.
Yes, so I apologise for that, but
I'm fine with it.
How much do you recognise this version of logistics utopia as being something that's actually attainable? How can you actually come up with a system where you cut by 90% the amount of truck movements into poor old Breda?
So I'm not sure to promise a number on that, but talking about logistics in general, as I said earlier, I mean, there will be no logistics provider in the world who would like to go into a city with one parcel in the truck. I mean, that's not the idea of logistics, as I said. Logistics is about optimizing freight flows in general, and not only because we have something to do with the nature, or we have to save costs, or we have all these regulations in the city. That's a natural thing for a logistics provider to optimize as much as possible his trucks, his fleet, his everything, the lanes. So that's of course our approach and aspiration as well. And I mean, and the solution could be something which I mentioned earlier, something like a consolidation center. I'm not sure whether the term consolidation center is the right one, because that's not a new term. That's pretty old actually. And I think consolidation centers have been around for a number of years, but in terms of technology, they are not really cutting edge. And I think with enhancing technology, we can do much better than we did in the past. And that's the idea of a smart urban center or smart urban freight center, how you name it, outside of a city to exactly do what you said. You consolidate the flows which goes into the city, and to put everything as you can in one truck, and use one instead of 100 or something. But I mean, it's a long way to go to that, because you need to cooperate with a couple of different suppliers, with customers, and it's complex. But we're working on that.
Yeah.
And we already run a successful consolidation center in Heathrow Airport. I mean, it's probably a different thing because it's an airport and not really a city. But I think we as DHL can learn from that example and bring that into the rest of the world, hopefully. Or similar thing.
I wanted to, the consolidation center, we have introduced in a couple of projects that we are running is the word cross-chain control centers, which not necessarily means the physical consolidation, but the orchestration and organization of cross-chain activities, bundling, better usage of assets, combining. But that requires, and that's typically something that in research projects and development projects we are carrying out today, that requires rethinking of your business model, rethinking of your pricing strategy, rethinking of incentive structures. Instead of fighting against constraints of your municipalities, see the business challenge and rethink the business model, which is a completely different attitude.
Right. Okay. Now, Michael Brown, I couldn't quite see whether you were gesturing that there's somebody who wants to ask something while we're...
There was a couple of hands
well, we're all in favour of that. Okay. Tell us who you are and what your question is, please.
Oui, vous m'entendez? Oui, bonjour. C'est une question pour Monsieur Benz que j'ai entendu dire d'une...
Okay, apparently now you can speak. Now, whatever there is interpretation. It was a bit of a surprise that it is French. So this is channel 6, by the way, for the English speakers. So apparently it all seems to work. Everything is okay. Everything is hunky-dory. Perfect. So one question I would like to ask Mr. Benz, one question. First of all, he said that optimization leads to a reduction in warehouse stocks, so that we need an optimization of transport flows, of goods flows, of freight flows, but that does not necessarily mean more transport, more traffic. And he also mentioned mentioned trucks, for instance, reduction or whatever, increase from 48 to 65. That would reduce traffic, but that would mean higher stocks in warehouses. So is it more about sustainable growth or what? If we are in favor of less stocks in warehouses, I mean, what should we do?
One of the remarks that you make was my example of the 48% usage of truck capacity to 65. Your thesis is that leads to higher stock levels in different hubs. That is not necessarily true. And that's what I introduced with the word cross-chain control. If you can combine the same lane of different value chains and combine the transport activity from that lane and bundle cargo over different supply chains, then you have a higher usage of your asset or your infrastructure. And that does not change at all the different, let's say, stock levels in the different hubs. You just combine cargo flows in specific lanes. That can be the last mile where the potential is the biggest, of course.
It does strike me that one of the things that constantly strikes me about all forms of logistics, and this isn't trying to be rude about logistics operators, is that people don't actually know that much about how things are moving and how they could optimize the movements. And it does strike me that this is something that, with improved information technology and improved capability to handle vast amounts of information and to process it in interesting ways, it does strike me that there should be improved potential for this kind of consolidation, so that you are running a truck empty less often. But what's your feeling about that?
Yeah, but that was what I mentioned in the beginning. This automatically implies, if you implement this and increase the usage of the truck, that means a win-lose situation for the other player, right? If I combine two trucks into one, then one of them goes bankrupt. And if you look at it as a threat, they don't want to collaborate with their competitor to combine those cargo flows. If you look at it as a challenge, then with two trucks, instead of both driving half empty, they can serve 4 customers instead of 2 customers by only having 2 trucks available. So do you see it as a threat, or do you see it as a challenge? If you are the service provider, the transport company, and you look at it as a threat, you will never collaborate with your competitor. Yeah. If you see it as a challenge, you improve your revenue model because your cost does not that much increase, but your revenue increases the more. And that requires, again, this business model and revenue issue, rethink that structure in total.
It also sounds like a situation that could end up leading to an early morning visit from the European Commission if one isn't careful, which I think might be another barrier. But
yeah, that's a good point. One of the research topics in some of the project is how far are competitors allowed to have agreements to collaborate, or do you need a third party in between? Let's say an independent cross-chain control orchestrator or something like that. The strange thing is governments want us to collaborate and reduce and be sustainable and reduce emissions, etc. And by the time that we make agreements to do and realize that, we get punished because we are not allowed to do it, which is a bit strange.
It looks like we've got a question here. I'm mildly tempted to ask Petra Kevit how much she collaborates with her competitors to come up with more economically viable cargo flows, but it's probably not a fair question. Tell us who you are and what your question is.
Damiani, European Commission. I just wonder whether there are...
You're not here to raid us, are you?
A genuine question. I just wonder whether there are experiences or prospects for the use of passenger transport for freight in urban environments, the dual use of existing passenger transport infrastructure, light rail, trams.
Perhaps we'll start with Michael Brown and then...
Well, just very quickly, I mean, there have been some interesting experiments. Obviously, people are familiar with the tram. Trams being used for moving vehicle parts is a classic and well-known slide in urban freight transport, I think, in Dresden, and initiatives in Zurich with the use of trams in this system. I know that in Paris they're looking at it very seriously when you're thinking about new infrastructure. And in London, we've even had someone come up with the idea to have a new kind of iconic red bus, which would be a freight bus. So, but it's not the mayor of London who thought of that, but somebody else. And so I think there are initiatives, but there are also examples of where it's been very difficult to do. And I think Amsterdam was one of those cases which maybe somebody wants to comment on a bit more.
Yeah. It also strikes me, this is not directly relevant, but London, of course, has dedicated logistics underground, which at the moment in the form of the Post Office Railway, which is sadly sitting unused at the moment. So there are unused opportunities out there. Wim Bent, you say something on this.
When you raise this question, I immediately have to think about I don't know exactly, but about 25 years ago in the Netherlands, we had the Ministry of Education. Our minister then was Minister Ritsen. And he introduced that all the students studying at a university in the Netherlands got free public transport. And immediately, some of those students started courier services and delivery of parcels because they could travel for free. So they started competing with DHL and PTT Post, etc. And they set up very successful companies who earn a lot of money because they had no cost. The ministry paid. And they started a business on that. So this idea is already very old. And one of the new projects that we are just starting up right now is the project that we call freight hitchhiking. Not necessarily in city areas, but especially outside city areas, where, for example, we have to stop the bus service because nobody's in the bus anymore, or we have to stop delivering milk because nobody wants to have only milk there. And if you look back 50, 60, 70 years ago, those services were there, and they already combined public transport. They brought your clothes to the dry cleaning service. They picked up your groceries if you asked them. They never sent an invoice. There was neighbor services to each other. And now we are back to that, let's say, that history from then. And the project Freight Hitchhiking tries to combine the public transport, whether if it's bicycle or bus or taxi or tram or metro or whatever, with parcel service and delivery service in freight. But also there, you have to, again, rethink how to share revenue, how to share cost, because if I'm investing and you have the profit, then nothing happens unless we make new agreements.
Okay. Your story about the students reminds me of a story my mother told me about being in the Irish Republic 40 odd years ago during a postal strike, and old age pensioners had free bus travel, and suddenly every pensioner was travelling across Ireland free to deliver letters for people. I think we've got quite a lot of questions. Perhaps could you, I mean, you obviously carry quite a lot of freight on passenger aircraft, but I think that's probably not what we're talking about here.
That's exactly what I wanted to mention. I mean, you know, in air freight, it's absolutely usual to have cargo as well as passengers on board, and you know, in every aircraft you see, you don't see it actually, but you know that also freight in it. So that's one remark, and probably the second one on the competitors. So you know that we have thousands of subcontractors all over the world, and to a certain extent they are all competitors, right? Because they have small businesses, and you know, and that's a kind of collaboration with, just as one example to your earlier point.
Okay, now somebody has been waiting quite patiently down here to ask a question, I think, but it looks like the microphone's up here. So we'll come to you in a moment.
Yes, I'm Jim Modavali from National Public Radio in the U.S. I have a couple of related questions. One, I've heard that transit or transportation is actually only 4% of the global supply chain, but it does appear to be what they call part of the low-hanging fruit, which makes it more attractive to address this part of the supply chain if you're trying to reduce the carbon intensity of the whole supply chain. So I thought maybe you could comment on that.
When you say it's 4% of the
carbon impact of the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a related thing, in the States, we now have Smith Electric building electric box trucks that are like 24 feet long for a lot of urban deliveries, and it seems to be quite popular. A lot of companies like Coca-Cola and Frito-Lay and some pharmacies are using that. I was wondering if that has potential in Europe.
Right. Okay. So that I think the first question was essentially, you know, how much of an overall impact does it have if supply chain costs are, if supply chain is generating if transport is generating a relatively low proportion of the overall carbon emissions from the supply chain. This is a difficult question, so Michael Brown, please answer it concisely.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's without going into the detail of the figure, one could agree that might be the case, but in a way, the CO2 story is only part of the story for cities, because clearly you have a whole set of other issues around the movement of goods and people, which needs to be addressed, and that includes things like noise and visual intrusion, the feel of being in the city, how to deal with historic centres. So, you know, while CO2 is an important measure at a macro level or a global level or a national level, at a city level, it's also important because it's written into their policy discussions and policies generally. But there are many other things that are also perhaps more pressing in some ways about noise, safety, congestion, and other features that we need to think about.
Perhaps we can address this question quickly to these gentlemen over here. Perhaps given the relatively small proportion of the overall carbon emissions from the supply chain, say bringing a computer from China or something like that, perhaps it's not even really worth pursuing your greener modes of transport given the overall benefit. What would the two of you have to say about that? Yeah.
Okay. Well, once again, we are talking about the last mile, and I'm very happy about that. We have seen in the discussion, under the break condition, how we can learn from each other, that there are several good reasons to go for a two-step delivery and not to do it in one. For example, the DHL is a parcel service as well. And we know that the parcel services, for sure, are conquering market shares for good reasons. Not that 25 trucks are going to 25 cities, but that one is going into one city center. Now, what's about the computer coming from China? For me, the solution must be seen on the economic side. The prices for energy, and that means also for transport freight, will increase terrible. So if the freight companies cut up the last mile, this was your proposal over there, maybe they are coming faster to easier solutions. And the companies, the small companies for the last mile delivery are already existing. Or they will improve their services there as DHL can do. Why not? This is wonderful. I think this is the approach we need. Mm-hmm. And the congestion is one aspect of the whole climate debate in city centers. And here we have the chance to react now, to go for solutions already now. And we have to do that.
Yeah, okay. Now, over to you, perhaps. I mean, I think I'm probably producing an unfair summary of the question, but I think the question is a little bit, is it really worth tackling this 4% of the problems that comes from carbon emissions, the 4% that comes from transport in the overall supply chain's carbon emissions? Is that, is it worth switching things to inland waterways to get that down, or are there other benefits from inland waterways on top of that? What would you say?
Well, first of all, the 4% already illustrates that the margin to improve is rather limited, but indeed the specific energy consumption in inland navigation is quite favorable, and setting aside the railways, which use to a great extent also nuclear power, which is not measurable in this respect, inland navigation is to be considered as the second best mode of transport, next to the bicycle, of course. The point is, it is a political issue, and the 4% is measured in a different way in another context. We experience the pressure from the political side that wants to reduce overall from the transport sector the CO2 charge and to improve the carbon footprint. So we are, as quite a sustainable mode of transport, challenged to do even better. And although we use the zero emission concept for a long-term perspective of inland navigation, that will be difficult to reach, but we have made great steps in introducing quite recently LNG as an energy in inland navigation, and we expect that in the coming 20 years a large part of the fleet will be equipped with the respective engines and will be supplied by this form of energy. On the local level, where we are discussing on, it is also seen from the political side. Cities and regions, they also have their targets to fulfill regarding the overall CO2 emissions, and therefore we cannot escape, let's say, from this issue. Although the total charge measured in volume is modest and perhaps I will not say negligible, but does not enable big steps. We cannot outsource ourselves from this discussion. We have to take our share in the measures to be taken.
Okay. Now, I'm aware that you asked about electric vehicles. We discussed electric vehicles before, but I think you're asking specifically about these relatively large electric vehicles that are being used in the US. I just wonder, Petra Kevit, if this, I don't know if you're aware of these vehicles, or if they, I know DHL has, certainly isn't operating Air Express in the US anymore, so perhaps you're...
Probably some of my colleagues. So Martin, I'm happy if you can support on this question.
Good afternoon, Martin Brown from DHL. Was the question in regards to Smith's electric vehicles in particular? What I can say is that I know that we've operated them for our urban consolidation centres at London Heathrow Airport and also in support of Bath and Bristol city councils, particularly for the last mile deliveries, as part of a suite of options that also included some of the benchmarking we did with Volvo technology on their low emissions diesel vehicles, and also bicycle deliveries for the last meter deliveries. So that collaboration with Smiths and looking at their electric vehicles has been part of our ongoing operations. Specifically, the size of vehicle were 9-ton vehicles. It's quite possible that we've been looking at other parts of their fleet in other operations.
There we are. Okay, I hope that goes some way to answering your question. I'm aware we've got an awful lot of people wanting to ask questions. Now, you here, could we get the microphone to this man, because he's been waiting so long and I'm beginning to feel really quite sorry for him. Can you...
Thank you. My name is Lasse Fridström. I'm from the Institute of Transport Economics in Oslo, Norway. Wim Benz mentioned the low capacity utilization on the highway. I suspect that when several logistics operators compete in serving a large urban area, each of them accessing points all over the city, the capacity utilization could drop even lower. And one might imagine that if the operators could cooperate in dividing the city into sectors, one operator serving one sector on behalf of all the others, you could really gain some efficiency. Now, in the laws of competition, there seems to be a ban on such cooperation. And I would like to ask the panelists, how do you view this? Is this really an obstacle that you feel in your daily planning, and perhaps also the European Commission would have an opinion on this? I remind you that there is an exemption to this ban, in that if the cooperation provides efficiency that also provides a certain gain to the consumers, it's actually allowable. So I would like to know, is this an obstacle that, that really works, and could it be removed?
Okay, but I mean, perhaps I think given the number of hands going up, we're going to have to be fairly brief in our answers, but perhaps Wim Benz, you could be first in this.
Yeah. First of all, your remark about if you combine for the last mile, then of course maybe the utilization of the vehicle even goes down. But if it goes down for only a very small distance, then the net effect in total on the value chain is almost nothing. If you can combine it on the long distance, not the last mile, but from DC to country or whatsoever, if you can optimize the volume there, that's a bigger effect, of course. So that makes the netto result much better. If you look at the question about collaboration and what are the obstacles are in the business models. What agreements do we have? If I invest and you have win, how do we share revenue? How do we share risk? How do we share investments? And that requires rethinking. And that's where the big, and that's not that simple. If you look at the literature from other sectors, the soft aspects of collaboration are the most difficult ones to cover before something starts.
Okay, Michael Brown, perhaps, I mean, there's obviously a balance to be struck here because for consumers, there's obviously an interest in having competition between people. I'm not sure if I were, well, for instance, you see in the United States, people who are captive shippers of a particular railroad tend to complain about it pretty bitterly. If my sector of a city was handed over to a logistics provider I didn't like, I might be a bit upset. What's the balance between these two things, do you think?
Well, I mean, I suppose the obvious answer is a complicated question, but yeah, it illustrates the point that this question of the optimization in the chain depends at the level at which you're looking at it. So that, you know, what is maybe perfectly optimum for one company or part of a company may not be optimum at the supply chain level, may not be optimum if we redrew the supply chain boundaries a bit, and may not be at all optimum if we looked at it geographically and for the city. How you then go to making this more optimum from the city is a tricky one, and I don't know about the regulatory aspects of that, but it's clearly something that has to be addressed, and the liability aspects, because people are signing contracts where they are liable for receiving a signature on delivering the product. So those two things clearly have to be addressed. They could be addressed. There are examples of where these things happen like that, and we could derive model contracts or model solutions to it. But just to emphasize that, you know, a mile or a kilometre performed in the urban area is, in some ways, you know, it's a very important kilometre. And I'm not saying that a kilometre performed on a motorway isn't at all important, but, you know, we need to remember this is where, as Petra said right at the start, this is where people live and work and expect to have a certain, you know, quality of life in this livability context.
Yeah, okay. Now, Petra Kevit, I imagine you don't want to go to jail for trying to do any of this. If you aren't going to end up in jail because of setting up such a consortium in an area, is that an attractive idea, or is it something that is just so alien to how you do business and how you compete that you wouldn't want to do it?
Yeah, I mean, not much to add on what you said, so I think it's quite a complex question and quite a complex solution on that, because you need to bring all the parties together, you know, to have the politics behind that, and, you know, to a little bit force people or, you know, companies to do this kind of a joint approach. I think it's a future vision, but probably too early to think about that today. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
to be honest.
I'm sure the person from the European Commission heard that. Somebody over here, you don't need to visit their offices. Somebody over here has been wanted to ask a question for a while. I see there's somebody very keen over here as well, and we're going to come to George Giannopoulos.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Wanda de Bosch from the Belgian Road Research Center. I have a question for the panelists. Mr. Benz mentioned constraints set up by local public authorities to ban trucks and logistics activities from the city center. And I would like to point out another issue why logistics activity are forced to move outside of the city center. It's the land price. The land price in urban area is very high, and there is a huge competition between all the activities to keep in urban center. So very often logistics activities like consolidation center are forced to move outside of the urban area. And so the vehicle kilometers of the last mile's delivery is increasing. So my question is, do you think it's the role of the public authorities to keep the logistics activities within the city center? And how can they do this? And do you have some examples of good practices to do this?
Well, and that's a very good question, because I was thinking earlier that one of the questions we haven't managed to address yet is actually urban planning. Do we actually want to keep, for instance, retailing within the city centre, or do we want to put shops actually in places where it's easier for the trucks to get at them on the outskirts of the city, and force people to travel out to them, which has been what's happened over the last little while in many places. I'll start with the gentleman on my left. Just very quickly, do you think it's important that logistics stay within city centres? It probably works, at least for you, for cyclists, I would think.
Well, where is this in the city centre? Is it outside the last mile or not? For me, it's outside of the last mile. And let me mention, it's really an important figure that space is rare in city centres, and the prices will increase. So space is not only rare for the logistic centres, it's also rare for the vehicles. And we need more space to allow all the people to have access to the city centres. So to create livable cities, we have to see that, in my opinion, more than 50% in the future of the city delivery will be done by small vehicles. And cycling will be playing an important role on that. And it's good for us to know that we have also the competition between the cities, one to each other. And it's looking quite nice to see the competition of those cities we call cycling-friendly cities, for they are improving very, very fast their livability. And all the other effects and sustainability are also increasing by that.
Okay. Now, Hans van der Werf, from your point of view, I imagine quite a lot of inland motorway harbours can be outside the city centre. You also talked about the issue that you want to safeguard the traditional city centre harbours so that people can continue to use them. How important an issue is it for you that you keep those city centre areas as the vital areas for logistics?
It is essential. Without these sites, you can forget, let's say, efficient waterway transport inside of the urban areas and the very city centres. The difficulty is that the earning power of the square meter used for some port activities is much lower than the earning power for housing or for offices. And therefore, the local politics should, let's say, intervene and set up a clear policy regarding the sustainable transport development in their region, because these, let's say, little earning square meters do have an essential role in the larger concept. I think the example that has given London in this respect is worthwhile studying for other cities, where the scarce remaining services is being distributed with specific targets in the context of the urban logistic concepts. That should be a rule, in fact, that has to be applied by other cities as well.
What do you make of this issue, Michael Brown?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously it's important, and it's where the city authority has a key role, is in the planning side of this. And I think it's at different levels, as Wanda suggests. There's this sort of level about reserving areas of different sizes, because sometimes maybe we're not talking about a very big, not such a big space as we think, and the initiatives in Paris with logistics hotel concept might mean that by building up a little bit, we could sometimes not use as much land as we thought traditionally, and that's, I guess, where these new concepts are really important. But it goes to even any kind of development. We should think much more about the logistics issues of any type of development. So if we have mixed-use development, there are logistics questions about that, because there will be time-of-day problems. But when we have any development, there's a temptation for developers to use all of the square meters for the most profitable aspect and forget about the loading and unloading. And if we forget about the loading and unloading, then we simply displace that activity onto the street, where, as we well know, there is simply insufficient curb capacity to actually handle what we're doing now, let alone if we have, new thriving businesses, which I hope, obviously George Giannopoulos made the point, yes, there may be a temporary point. We would hope there's only a temporary point at which we can maybe address some of these issues before we see the numbers go up again. So I think it should be reserved. But Wanda asked a very hard question, how to enable that to happen. And in different cities, I think there will be very different ways to think about that, because some cities do own quite a lot of property and land under their own control. Some of it in some cities is tied up in parking, which is a big revenue generator, but you can rethink priorities. And if you rethink those, you could let that land to logistics activities at a rent or at a price that's appropriate for those kind of activities. But it's a policy decision.
Mm-hmm. Wim Bens, you've been talking about Breda. What are the challenges of keeping things in the city centre?
Yeah, what you see already is examples like large retailers who have, just for, let's say, economies of scale, they close the smaller shop and integrate two small shops in two neighborhoods into one bigger shop somewhere in the middle. But the middle seems to be the city, let's say, site. In a few cities I know that Albert Heijn is creating a new shop which is twice the volume of a few others that they close up. But the new one is not in the city center anymore. It's somewhere in the, let's say, aside the city, because exactly can it be reached by many people at the same time? Can trucks get there fast and unload and unload fast? So the criteria are changing. And one of the remarks to municipalities, I would say, is they tend to take the lead in this type of projects. They should only set constraints, and they are there, but then let the private industry take the lead. The smart people who have expertise are not the people from the municipalities. They can set constraints, but then draw back.
Okay, and from DHL's point of view, are you trying to keep city centres alive and vigorous?
Probably more a general remark. So, of course, for every company, be it a logistics provider, be it a retailer, be it a manufacturer, where the plant or the plant or the factory or the retail outlet is, kind of where the right place is to be, is critical. It's a critical decision for every company, and of course for us as well. And I think it depends a little bit on the specific situation, which city it is, and which kind of goods are in this kind of warehouse or consolidation center. That's a kind of, we decide that, it's a kind of really decisive decision in each case where the warehouse should be located, and which is best in terms of the street and the costs and the miles from the city center and so on and so forth. And I think there's not the one answer on that. So I think it's rather a little bit outside of the cities than in the middle of the center, due to a couple of reasons. But I mean, it depends really on the goods and the company, the customer.
Okay. Now we've got only just over 5 minutes left. I'm going to take one last question up here, and I'll come over very briefly to Professor Giannopoulos afterwards, but perhaps we could hear.
Yes, thank you very much. My name's Chris Welsh. I'm with the UK Freight Transport Association, which is one of the larger trade associations and represents some of the companies that have been mentioned here, particularly DHL. I think DHL cover very, very clearly what they are doing in the urban area at the moment, but I wanted to focus on the collaboration sort of issue, where it should take place, and which stakeholders might be better to do it, and where it actually occurs. We've done a lot of work with the major retailers in the UK, the top 10 retailers. Now, they beat each other up in the marketplace and on the high street, and are very reluctant, and have hitherto been very reluctant to collaborate. But they have, through us, through their trade association, collaborated together to, for example, show how they can better use alternative modes of transport to optimize performance. And they've got to the point where we produced a publication which they've contributed to, and I've got limited numbers here, so if anybody wants to see it. But I think the key point that comes out of that is that they are getting to the point now where they're prepared to share loads with each other, share the data on their data flows. And they do that through their trade association, so it kind of removes some of those competition issues. And that's producing quite positive results in terms of making use of alternative modes and building up flows to optimize overall deliveries. Thank you.
Perhaps I'm just, we're really running out of time, so...
Is that a question?
Well, I'm just, perhaps you'd like to comment briefly on it. I mean, I think the suggestion is that trade associations can provide a good means of forming a kind of collaboration that otherwise, say, might end up with everybody in jail. So, do you see scope for that?
You mean for collaboration?
Collaboration via trade associations, I think, from your customers, so that they consolidate their demand in helpful ways.
Oh, that's really difficult question.
I would like to comment on that. It helps in avoiding, let's say, the legislation discussion that we had earlier in terms of what is allowed or what isn't allowed. Second, it neutralizes the discussion. It eliminates a little bit of the direct competition. And funny as it is, if you introduce a new player into the supply chain, then normally you would say the total supply chain becomes more expensive because somebody extra is involved and he has to eat and he has to earn money. But the funny thing, by introducing this neutral third party, initially the costs go up, but in the bottom line, the costs go down for the total supply chain because this neutral party starts to reorganize the business model between the existing players. And that's a win-lose for somebody, but it's a win-win for the whole chain.
I think Chris made the important point that, maybe it starts with a discussion about data and flows, not necessarily going straight to the commercial contract, but let's be visible about where things are to some extent. And obviously that's a difficult step in its own right, but if a trade association can help that step, then maybe you can sort of make some more rational use of capacities, whether that's infrastructure or vehicles.
Okay.
So, probably one remark finally. So in general, I'm a friend of, sharing everything or sharing all you can, because that's kind of, a rule for working on innovation. So, but, I can't give you the answer for the entire company on that, because again, that depends and it's kind of critical thing. But yeah, as you said, you can start with sharing some data and probably, go step by step on that.
Okay. Now, I'll go over very quickly to Professor Giannopoulos. We've got 2 minutes left, so.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I didn't mean to come so late in the discussion, but the point I wanted to make is relevant to the previous one, and this is the kind of business models we are using. We didn't speak a lot about this. We are talking normally about the situation in which you have one man, one truck, and this creates a lot of problems and difficulties. So the solution that we are applying now and we are working on in Thessaloniki, and I come back to say what we are doing there, is to form some kind of cooperatives. We have some successful experience from bus cooperatives. We're trying to transform this experience to urban logistics and try to have them cooperate. The economic crisis is making them more willing to cooperate, and therefore we are hoping that through these cooperatives we can consolidate a bit more the capacity and so on. The second thing I wanted to say is, by way of concluding maybe, the very importance of smart logistics. I very much agree to what Wim Benz has been saying about the importance of this, and I just wanted to inform that in Thessaloniki again we are inaugurating this month the smart mobility system, which will provide information also to urban deliveries about routes, about traffic conditions, real-time traffic conditions, and environmental route and fleet management that they can use. So that's all I wanted to say by way of concluding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. I think we probably don't quite have time for any further discussion on that, but I think I've been hugely encouraged by a number of people contributing from the floor. I think it's shown a real engagement with this subject. We're just about to come up to our lunch break, but I think it's worth perhaps recapping a little bit of what we've been thinking about. There are enormous challenges in this issue of getting stuff the last mile. It sounds like it should be easy, but we've been discussing the constraints of space, for which perhaps bicycles or small electric vehicles are a solution. We've been looking at the problems of pollution, for which inland waterways can be, make a big contribution in reducing. We've been looking at these problems of efficiency, that the trucks aren't full enough. And I think we've reached a conclusion that the way forward is probably, to some extent at least, collaboration, albeit we have to be careful to maintain competition as well. We can make much better use of data, so we need to think about how we use that to make sure that we are carrying things as efficiently as we possibly can. And finally, as Michael Brown has been emphasising throughout, we really need leadership on the political level as well. People who can take the strategic view about what shape our city is going to be, what a livable city is for the future. And I hope that we're all going to go out from this having been perhaps a little bit inspired, having thought a little bit more deeply about these questions, to think about how we can keep goods moving within the kinds of livable cities that we all want. Now, Michael Brown's asked me to point out that there's another discussion if you haven't had enough of talking about urban freight transport, and you can see the number of hands that went up. I think people are still eager to keep talking about this issue. There's going to be another discussion at 4:30 p.m. in banqueting room 1 on level 0. Is that correct? Have I got the details correct?
Yes, banqueting room 1. I mean, it's not what I would have thought you would have a banquet in, and it's quite a small room. So I suppose but anybody who would like to hear from the speakers who took part in the discussion, not this panel of speakers, but the panel who were discussing about the experience from New York, from Latin America, from France, and from Japan. And for the EU level, we hope to get them together again so we can ask them some questions. People are welcome to come, but it's quite a small room. But,
right. Okay. Okay, well, thank you for that, and thank you for... Yeah. And thank you to all the panel for their contributions. Thank you to you for your magnificent questions and for your attention. And I do hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you throughout the rest of the programme here at the International Transport Forum. Thank you.